Hello YouTube, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you might know that the consumer electronics that I tend to cover usually happen to be on the older side, but that's not a rule, as I'm more than happy to cover any new electronics. One such piece of electronics is a new Sony gadget, the Sony Walkman. Well, that's what I was planning to cover anyway until, due to some current world events, I got my hands on the Sony PlayStation 5. Now, I didn't know they still made them after 2, but what do I know anyway? Let's take a look at it. Thankfully, a kind friend of mine let me film with it. You can check out his channel right here, and he's up to usually being good at video games, unlike yours truly usually is. So definitely check him out if you're into that sort of stuff. Let's dive right. Oh, and of course, to make this video somewhat relevant to where most of my subscriber base comes from, and in generally take a unique angle looking at this system, let's compare it to a 1980s home computer. That's right, this is a face-off between the Commodore 64 and the PlayStation 5.
So the unboxing experience itself is pretty normal, nothing too fancy, but it's elegant. Though I suppose I did expect a little more from a console that feels larger than life, but speaking of large, this thing is not only quite large, but it's a lot heavier than it looks. While contributing to a premium build quality, the weight is really no joke. Be very careful when you open yours. If you think you can gauge the strength you need to apply by looking at it, add another 10 strength points to your strength stat and go with that. Aside from some manuals and cables and other things that nobody really finds interesting unless they're trying to stretch out a YouTube video, the controller is the first thing you get out of the box. The controller at first glance itself kind of reminds me of the Google Pixel 2, a two-tone color scheme with such stark contrast. It's a design I actually really like. One could say it's inspired by Google's, if not for the fact that, actually unlike the main console, the black part here is mate, which makes a lot of sense from a practical standpoint, as otherwise it would become a fingerprint magnet in no time. I can't help but think of the Sony Boomerang here a little bit, with the triggers not standing out as much and the longer handles. Just imagine that the black part of the controller doesn't exist and it looks like it's the Boomerang, just smaller. And, well, speaking of the triggers, These triggers feel like literally nothing else. At first glance, they are just triggers. You press them, but in terms of feeling, they have a lot more in common with like an analog knob you'd see and feel on a high-end hi-fi, if you have one. Somehow Sony has managed to make them so smooth that your brain at all times knows exactly how much you're pressing down without ever looking at the controller. This is the definitive controller to play racing games, at least out of the ones I've ever tried. And that's not even talking about that crazy haptic trigger functionality stuff. And honestly, those things are just a pleasure to press. If Hand Cream was a controller with triggers on it, this is what it would feel like. But no less weird than that analogy is the controversial design of the PlayStation 5 itself, so how about we dive right into that? This iteration of the PlayStation home console really moves away from the compact, smart Japanese gadget design philosophy of the PS4 and PS1, and instead towards more of a design that announces its presence and is unapologetically futuristic with a distinct identity. Yet despite that, it's not as shallow as, say, the Tesla Cybertruck or one of those new BMWs. From afar, one might mistake it for having gamer angles, but once you notice all the details in the little curves filled with elegance and careful attention to detail, far more than the previous PlayStation consoles. From the point of view of someone who's interested in consumer electronics design, between this and the simple design of the Xbox Series X, there is really no contest. The Series X might feel safe, reminding us of the home appliance that goes well with gaming, but in 20 years this thing will be in a design museum, and the Xbox will be lost like tears in the cloud. Though this particular unit might not end up in the museum necessarily, because in 20 years you can still turn this on and play it, thanks to the fact that there's no need to sign into your account to use this device that you supposedly own. Microsoft. The smell of no online-only bullshit DRM is like the cozy feeling of sleeping in freshly washed bed sheets. In contrast to Microsoft first promising to shit the bed in 2013, then sucking that poopy back in due to popular demand and apparently not being able to hold it in any longer, finally letting it flow all over you, the customer. If there's one oddity, it's that the front features one USB-A port and one USB-C port. I guess this is really practical, having one of each as opposed to two of the same type, but when placed horizontally, it just looks a little out of place on this otherwise very elegant console. I mean, the buttons are tiny. It's kind of an oddly practical thing to see, but then again, it's honestly such a nitpick, and I'm not even sure if two USB-C ports or two USB-A ports would look that much better. And I do appreciate that the USB-A port is towards the wider looking side of the console, being bigger. Someone's clearly thought about this. What a surprise. Obviously a pleasant one. This design is well thought out, and with all that engineering and the cooling, and I mean, I know not much about hardware design and thermals and things like that really from an engineering standpoint, but it looks sophisticated, and so far it seems to be pretty functional while at it. Those grills at the top, I mean, damn, it just looks so sleek. And that glossy part, even though it's a fingerprint magnet area, you're not going to be manhandling this all the time. You're going to set this up one time. Just get one microfiber wipe just for when you're setting it up, so once it's all placed wherever it's going to go, you can wipe it down to give it that beautiful shine. But the only thing ruining it is the potential to see the reflection of your own face in it. The controller has that attention to detail as well. It's almost impossible to tell just by looking, but the analog sticks have way higher quality material on them, and thank God for that, because the PS4 analog sticks material was frankly not fit for purpose, which is long-term gaming sessions. Don't get me started on the Vita. No, this is a whole new level. The sticks themselves also feel a little bit more snappy. They require a little bit more pressure to move, which I think is a good thing. I can see how playing Rocket League 1v1s would feel great on this thing. Going back to USB for a minute, the controller is USB-C, and thank God it is. Micro USB is just awful. And look, I recognize that having one connector on phones, controllers, and keyboards and everything is great for the consumer and has obvious environmental benefits, but the moment I first used USB-C made going back to using micro USB seem like being on tour of an Amish settlement. You can sort of picture how they get by and entertain the thought in your mind of what you would do in such a situation, but very few of us would want to actually live like that. And micro USB is not a way I want to live, by any stretch of the imagination. And look, I cannot stress this enough. This flimsy cocksucking piece of a shit goddamn time vampire of a connector is so flimsy I have a whole graveyard of cables that sometimes work, ones that work for charging my vape, ones that you bend in a certain way and then they work, and so on. Seriously, go try to use a PS4 controller with like a micro USB cable wired up to something like your PC or Raspberry Pi and tell me with a straight face that it always works. You might say, oh, but the controller is meant to be used wirelessly. No shit, Sherlock, and it's no issue on the PlayStation 4, but I want to play Toxic Waste on the Sega Genesis emulator, not waste your time setting up the controller every single time simulator. Besides, desktop PCs still often lack any built-in Bluetooth functionality, and for pro gamer girl sessions, you want to be wired up to keep the controller battery full, just like you wire up to your Microsoft-issued Dorito Juice IV drip to keep your battery full. Oh, and speaking of batteries... So, thankfully no such nonsense here. The PlayStation 5 controller uses USB-C to charge and recharge, and for, working as a controller. So yeah. But that's it for the rants. Let's get to the point of this video. How does the PlayStation 5 stack up against a 1980s home computer that was used for gaming a ton? Well, obviously it massively outperforms it, even the controller massively outperforms it, and any such comparison would be very silly and you knew full well clicking on this video. But for giggles, why don't we compare the specs anyway to see how far we've come since then? Because the PlayStation 5 to me is a good example of both consumer electronics design, it's a piece of gaming history, at least that's my prediction. Watch that age horribly. I hope not. I'm cheering you on, Sony. Also send me free stuff. And it's a great example of just computer engineering, because this is a computer. And I can say exactly the same thing about the Commodore 64, just within its own era. Now, obviously I'm not gonna pop open the PlayStation 5 here. This isn't mine, and if it were mine, I'd be the last person I'd trust with opening it. So let's go through the specs one by one off a nice safe spec sheet that's not gonna destroy the console. So, diving right in, the PS5 has an AMD Zen 2 based 64-bit CPU with 8 cores clocked at 3.5 GHz. If I wager a guess, it's most likely a custom-built version of something like a 3700X, a Ryzen 3700X, because of the same base clock speed, assuming 3.5 GHz is the base clock and it speeds up to 4.4 GHz like the 3700X, and up when the power and thermal requirements are met. In contrast, Commodore 64 runs on an 8-bit MOS Technology 6510 CPU with only one core, because multi-core CPUs weren't a thing back then in home computers. Clocked at 1 MHz, or in PAL regions like good old UK here, 0.985 MHz. To put that into perspective, 1 GHz is 1000 MHz, meaning the PS5 at its base clock is 3,500 times more faster than the C64 CPU, not to mention the fact that it's got 8 times the processing cores. GPU on the PS5 is a custom RDNA 2 based 10.28 teraflops, 36 compute units at a 2.23 GHz with RTX support. It's worth mentioning that the PS5 actually uses an APU, meaning the GPU and CPU are both combined into a system on a chip unit. The C64, however, has separate chips, the GPU, using that term rather loosely, being a VIC-2 chip. There's few bases on which to even compare these, but the Commodore 64 outputs 320 by 200 resolution, which consists of a total of 16 colors on the screen at a time. The PS5 outputs in a max of 8K video, although it's safe to say that for most games it's really capped at 4K, but it can also go down to 1080p, although inexplicably missing out 1440p. Anyway, with a 4K resolution we have a total of 8,294,200 pixels. With HDR10, which the PS5 supports with a compatible monitor or television, allows for 1 billion colors per pixels. So in total, at 4K, we get 8,294,400,000,000,000 possible colors on the screen, which is more than 16 according to my calculations. Approximately 518 trillion times more. The refresh rate is the same though, 60Hz, at least with the NTSC's C64. I'm not sure if there'll be any PS5 games in 120 FPS, so that might actually change. On the PS5, the RAM is a shared 16GB GDDR6, meaning there is no dedicated VRAM, which means that in total it probably has less than the average PC. However, all of it is much faster, and Ryzen CPUs scale great with higher memory clocks. Even the jump from DDR4 300 MHz to 3200 MHz makes a bigger difference than you'd expect it on a desktop Ryzen, which is why that 448 GB a second memory bandwidth is pretty important as well. In contrast, the RAM on the Commodore 64 is 64 KB, hence the name. For perspective, 1 GB is 1 million kilobytes, so yeah, no discussion there, but the PS5 and the C64 here do have in common the fact that the RAM is shared between the CPU and the GPU. Although we don't know how much of the main RAM the PS5 can utilize for graphics, the C64 had 2 memory banks it was able to switch between, both 8 KB, making for a total of 16 KB of VRAM, which for 2D graphics, which is the only kind that was there, mostly stored custom sprites and such. As for storage, the PlayStation 5 uses a custom-built 825GB SSD, of which approximately 667.2GB is usable, most likely due to lots of reserved space for things like hibernation, as well as I/O operations like downloading a compressed Call of Duty, then uncompressing and installing the Call of Duty, meaning in the worst case scenario, you'd need twice the space. I highly doubt the PlayStation 5 OS, which I assume is a relatively simple GUI built on top of BSD, same as PlayStation 4, with custom drivers, uses anywhere near that amount of space. Still though, that disk read-write speed of 5.5GB is something to behold, and it's no joke, especially when you compare it to that time my PlayStation 3 took a century to install Mass Effect. The Commodore 64, on the other hand, features no onboard storage except for its ROM and RAM, but that doesn't really count, does it? The ROM is a 20KB chip of read-only memory that stores the kernel and Commodore's basic programming language and routines. When it comes to audio, the PlayStation 5 has custom 3D audio, which uses object-based spatial sound technology to create some of the most advanced 3D audio available, capable of reproducing hundreds of high-quality intricate sound sources, making individual raindrops come to life, according to Sony anyway. The C64 features 3 voices. Well, it also has 4 forms of waves, 3 amplitude modulators, 3 envelope generators, ring modulation, programmable filters, and 16-step volume controls. Ooh. Well, yeah, obviously you can't compare this. The main difference here really is the fact that the SID chip, or the sound interface device chip, is a sound synthesizer, meaning it's closer to a programmable synthesizer keyboard or MIDI, whereas the PlayStation 5, and well, anything modern, isn't limited to that, and instead simply decodes real audio samples stored digitally, and at some point this gets converted back to the analog sound signals that you hear through your keyboard or speakers. It does not by itself generate any sound, since it lacks any kind of built-in synthesizer, so the function of the two is quite different. Sony's 3D talk mostly means digital sound processing, routing it to different channels to the effect of realism, provided you have the appropriate hardware to reproduce it, which I'm sure Sony will sell to you. As for external storage, the PlayStation 5 has an NVMe slot for high-speed SSD storage expansion and an optional internal optical 4K UHD Blu-ray drive. I don't really count the USB HDD storage support because that is for PS4 games only as of this video at least. The Commodore 64 supports a tape drive on which games and programs could be stored and then loaded onto a Commodore 64 via the use of an external cassette tape deck accessory. It also supports a 5¼ floppy disk drive into which, you guessed it, you can insert a floppy disk, on which you can store data and programs as well as games. I don't count modern peripherals such as the SD2i-EC, which allow you to use an SD card with a C64 to get as much as 256GB of storage, as well as ones that let you use a hard drive, because those weren't really released back then. So the C64 might provide more options but less actual storage space, obviously. And that's not even mentioning the fact that the NVMe SSD drive will readily outperform a cassette tape deck in terms of read and write speeds, lest you acquire your SSD from Wish.com. As for other connectivity, the PlayStation 5 features an Ethernet port, Ethernet, Enderman, I don't know, ports for high-speed internet access for things like, using the internet. The C64 could also browse the internet, well, mostly bulletin board systems you dial into, although there is a way to access the modern internet with it, which anyone who's seen my other videos, like the one in this notification up here, can attest to. The PS5 also has an HDMI port for video output, 4 USB-A ports for interacting with various accessories like the PSVR virtual reality headset, and 1 USB-C port to fulfill the same function, I imagine, anyway. Aside from the disk drive and the dataset ports mentioned previously on the C64, also features a user port, which for all intents and purposes is like a serial port, the daddy to USB, to which you can connect various accessories such as a modem or a printer. It also features an expansion port, which allows for game cartridges, but cartridges can actually serve multiple different purposes, such as make game loading faster from disk or tape by replacing the routines the computer uses to load them, add functionality like a quick reset button, and even add 512 kilobytes of RAM. And these days, really a lot more than that if you want. Well, that's pretty much it. I mean, we've come a long way in computer processing power. Mind you, the PlayStation 5 costs $450, $449, or $1,500 if you're an idiot. The Commodore 64, when it was introduced, cost $1,500. That's in 2019 currency, so adjusted for inflation for the most part. Sure, the Commodore 64 isn't an ideal comparison since it wasn't just a games console, but also a home computer, one you'd sit at and do your taxes, and the price reflects that. The NES in 2020 dollars only cost $478, just about as much as the PlayStation 5. It'd make a lot more sense to compare consoles to consoles and computers to computers. But the Commodore 64 nonetheless is a system that's become part of gaming history. Not to mention computer history. And the PS5 is an impressively powerful computer, with I think lots of potential to make gaming history. Which is why I kind of just wanted to do this anyway. 2 pieces of hardware, some 40 years apart, bringing people joy in the form of video games, worlds to escape to, levels to beat, stories to experience. Let's keep that going.
Well, that's been my look at the PlayStation 5 and, generally comparing it to a computer that's really not too worth comparing it to. Yeah, I mean, past, present, future. It's interesting to look at things this way, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did, leave a like. Oh wait, what does this say? Oh wait, there's more. Power supply wise, the Commodore 64 can draw 22 watts, whereas the PlayStation 5 can draw as much as 350. Well, obviously, this makes it obvious. I mean, the Commodore 64 is a far superior system. Old good, new bad. Subscribe. Bye-bye. PlayStation.